A judge laughed when 17-year-old Naomi said she was representing her cousin in court, but by the time she finished speaking, the entire courtroom was dead silent. The courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and old floor polish. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Naomi Ellison stepped past the double doors, gripping a thick manila folder to her chest. She walked with purpose, but you could tell she'd rehearsed that stride in the mirror a few times. Her thrift store slacks were a little too short, the white shirt just slightly wrinkled, and her bun, braided tight and pinned, had loosened a little in the Georgia humidity. Still, she kept her head high. 17 years old, not a lawyer, not even a college student, but she was here to defend her cousin, and she wasn't planning to be dismissed. It was late morning in the Berrien County Courthouse in Nashville, Georgia, a modest building where everyone knew everyone. This wasn't the kind of courtroom where anything dramatic usually happened. Minor traffic offenses, small claims, an occasional custody dispute. The judge, Byron Talcott, had been on the bench for nearly 3 decades. Folks around town said he was from another time, which was a polite way of saying he didn't like change and barely tolerated anyone who brought it into his courtroom. When Naomi stepped up and introduced herself as Deshaun Little's legal representative, Judge Talcott squinted over his glasses like he was looking at something ridiculous he didn't quite understand. "You're what now?" he asked, glancing down at the docket. "I'm representing my cousin in this matter," Naomi said. Her voice was steady. "I've prepared a written argument and—" He didn't let her finish. "You're not a lawyer," he said, laughing lightly under his breath. "You don't look old enough to drive, let alone practice law." The courtroom chuckled. A few people shifted in their chairs to get a better look at her. One man in the back actually grinned like this was going to be the best entertainment he'd seen in weeks. Naomi's jaw didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. She simply nodded once, unfolded her papers, and said, "With respect, Your Honor, Georgia law allows individuals to represent others in non-criminal matters, as long as both parties consent." Judge Talcott raised an eyebrow. "And you're telling me he consents to this?" Deshaun, seated beside her in jeans and a t-shirt, leaned toward the mic. "Yes, sir, I do." You could feel the air shift just slightly. Naomi cleared her throat and added, "I'm prepared to proceed if the court is willing." The judge leaned back in his chair, silent for a beat too long. Then he smirked and waved his hand lazily. "Fine. This'll be interesting." The bailiff, an older man named Wiggins, leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes at Naomi with something closer to curiosity than scorn. Naomi arranged her papers carefully. She placed her handwritten notes in front of her, flipping to the one labeled opening statement. Her handwriting was neat, too neat for anyone to have rushed it. As she opened her mouth, someone near the back coughed out a laugh. The judge didn't stop it. Neither did Naomi. She just began. But before she could get more than 2 sentences in, the judge cut her off again. "Miss Ellison, just to humor me, where exactly did you get your law degree from?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I don't have one, but I've spent the last 2 years studying Georgia traffic law, civil procedure, and judicial conduct in my free time. I've attended public hearings in 3 counties, transcribed trial footage, and studied over 50 court opinions. So no, I don't have a degree, but I'm not here to waste the court's time." The room was quiet now. Even the clerk had stopped typing. But the judge still had one more trick up his sleeve. Judge Talcott exhaled through his nose like he was trying to decide whether this was a waste of time or a chance to enjoy a train wreck. He turned slightly in his chair and gave Naomi a dismissive little wave. "Proceed, Miss Ellison. By all means." Naomi didn't blink. She read her opening like she'd practiced it 100 times. Because she had. In her bedroom, standing in front of a mirror with her backpack balanced like a podium. Her voice didn't tremble as she laid out the facts. Deshaun had been pulled over for rolling through a stop sign outside the high school on a Saturday morning. No traffic, no pedestrians. But the ticket came with a court summons and a hefty fine. Naomi didn't just want to argue against the fine. She wanted it thrown out entirely. In the second row, a white woman in a peach blazer whispered something to the man next to her. He chuckled and shook his head. The clerk leaned back in her seat, chewing her pen cap, waiting for Naomi to stumble. And Deshawn? He looked down at his hands. Embarrassed. Maybe even a little angry. You sure you want to do this? He'd asked her that morning while they were waiting outside the courthouse. Naomi had replied without looking up from her notes. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. He hadn't said anything after that. Now, seated beside her at the defendant's table, he kept shifting in his chair like he wished he could disappear. He was 17 too, but Naomi made him feel younger just by sitting next to him. Naomi moved on to the issue of selective enforcement. The stop sign in question had been ignored by dozens of drivers that morning, including 2 local sheriff's deputies. Naomi had video footage taken by a neighbor, time-stamped and clear. It showed cars cruising past without pause. No lights, no sirens, no tickets. She placed a small USB drive on the table and looked up at the judge. With the court's permission, I'd like to submit this as evidence. Judge Talcott didn't move for a second. Then slowly he looked over at the bailiff. Let's take a look. The screen flickered on. The courtroom turned. The video wasn't flashy, just plain street footage from a home security cam. Car after car passed the sign without stopping. Naomi let it play for 20 seconds before pausing it and pointing out a license plate that belonged to a county sheriff. I'm not here to argue that the law shouldn't be enforced, she said. Only that it should be enforced fairly. No one laughed that time. But the judge? He folded his arms. And you think this proves your cousin was singled out? Naomi answered simply. It proves that enforcement isn't consistent. And when it isn't consistent, citations can become subjective. He stared at her for a long beat. Naomi didn't shrink under it. What most people in that room didn't know, couldn't know, was how she'd spent the past 2 summers sneaking into the back row of hearings across 3 counties. She'd taken notes with a worn-out pen, whispering legal terms into a tape recorder she borrowed from her science teacher. Nobody had shown her how to do this. Her high school didn't offer any law electives, and there weren't exactly internships for girls like her in Berrien County. So she taught herself. She'd spent late nights reading legal blogs and case opinions while her mom worked double shifts at the nursing home. She didn't have time for parties, and she wasn't interested in school dances. This was her thing. And now, the first time she had a real chance to use it, everyone in that room just saw a kid playing dress-up. Everyone but her. The judge cleared his throat. We'll admit the video for review. Continue. Naomi nodded and kept going, but the air hadn't changed yet. People still looked at her like this would eventually fall apart. But then Naomi said something that made even the court reporter lift her head. Naomi placed her palms flat on the table, leaned in just a little, and said, This citation isn't just about a stop sign. It's about accountability. And whether authority figures, including officers, are held to the same standards as the people they pull over. That line, that exact sentence. It didn't sound rehearsed, but it landed like a gavel. The room got quiet in a way it hadn't before. No more murmuring, no more half-smiles. The clerk stopped chewing her pen. Even Judge Talcott blinked like he hadn't expected her to say something that... real. Deshawn looked at his cousin differently too. He had known she was smart. Everyone in their family said so. But this was something else. Naomi didn't pause long. She flipped to her next page, her notes covered in color-coded highlighter. Blue for facts, green for law, yellow for quotes she'd memorized. She started referencing Owens v. State of Georgia, a 1999 case involving traffic enforcement and racial bias. She walked through the opinion, line by line, and explained how the court had acknowledged that uneven enforcement undermined public trust. The judge interrupted. Miss Ellison, are you comparing this case to Owens? That was a criminal matter involving... She didn't let herself flinch. The legal principles still apply, Your Honor. Selective enforcement affects the integrity of any legal proceeding, regardless of whether it's criminal or civil. He leaned back again, not smiling anymore. The courtroom wasn't bored anymore either. The woman in the peach blazer now sat forward in her seat, elbows on knees, listening. The man next to her stopped looking at his phone. Naomi continued. She brought up traffic enforcement statistics from their county, numbers she'd requested through a Freedom of Information Act request, and printed at the library. They showed that 83% of traffic stops over the past year involved black drivers, despite census data showing they made up just under 40% of the population. She laid the papers down in front of her. "I'm not accusing anyone of targeting my cousin," she said. "But I am asking this court to look at the pattern. Because if we ignore patterns, we allow them to continue. No drama, no raised voice, just facts, just quiet, pointed truth." Judge Talcott looked down at his notes, tapped his pen against the folder in front of him, then scribbled something. The bailiff, Wiggins, crossed his arms, not in defiance, just listening, really listening now. Deshawn whispered, "Yo, did you really get all those numbers?" Naomi whispered back, eyes still on the judge. "Took me 3 weeks." Deshawn blinked. He hadn't realized just how serious she'd been. A few rows back, someone coughed, but no one laughed this time. The judge didn't speak right away. He looked over the printouts, then back at Naomi. "You've certainly done your homework, Miss Ellison." She gave a single nod. Not smug, not eager, just ready. Then, for the first time since she entered the courtroom, Naomi paused. Not because she forgot what to say, but because she'd reached the turning point in her argument. "This isn't about winning," she said. "It's about fairness. And if the court believes my cousin truly broke the law, we'll accept the ruling. But if we're going to issue citations in this county, they need to mean the same thing no matter who's driving the car." That was the moment. Not when she quoted case law, not when she showed the numbers, but that sentence, the honesty of it, that cracked something open. The judge tapped his folder closed. "Let's take a 10-minute recess." Gasps weren't allowed in courtrooms, but you could hear it anyway, in the way people shifted, the way someone whispered, "He never does that." But during that break, Naomi would face her first moment of real doubt. Naomi sat on the hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, knees together, hands clasped tight around a bottle of water she hadn't touched. Her braid was slipping loose at the nape of her neck, but she didn't fix it. She stared straight ahead, as if watching something no one else could see. Deshawn sat beside her, bouncing his leg, glancing over every few seconds. "You good?" he finally asked. She nodded, then whispered, "Yeah. You don't look it." She smiled barely. "I didn't come here to look good." He chuckled. Then, more seriously, "Hey, thank you. For real. I didn't think you'd go that deep." She turned to him. "You didn't think I meant it?" "I mean, I knew you were smart. Just didn't know you were all this smart." Naomi didn't respond. The courtroom door opened, and the bailiff motioned toward them. "Let's get back to it." Inside, the mood was different. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter. Not quite respect, not quite admiration. Just attention. Real attention. Judge Talcott looked at Naomi when she re-entered. This time, he didn't squint or smirk, but he wasn't done testing her either. "Miss Ellison," he said, as soon as she returned to the stand. "Let's pretend, just for a moment, that your argument holds weight. Can you cite any statutory language that would directly support the dismissal of your cousin's citation?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. Georgia Code, Title 40-620 outlines proper stop sign enforcement, but it also gives room for interpretation in cases where enforcement may be applied inconsistently or selectively. Furthermore, according to the Equal Protection Clause, as established in Yick Wo v. Hopkins, selective enforcement based on arbitrary distinctions undermines the legitimacy of the law." The courtroom paused again. The judge leaned forward, elbows on his desk, eyeing her like he was trying to catch a crack in her armor. "I see you've been doing some serious reading," he said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Well then," he said, voice just slightly sharper. "If you're going to quote Yick Wo, then surely you're prepared to address how that decision applies outside of licensing issues." "Yes," she said again. Because the ruling's foundation wasn't just about licenses, it was about fairness under the law, It stated clearly that even if a law appears neutral, its application cannot be discriminatory. For the first time, Judge Talcott didn't interrupt. He let her finish. Then he folded his hands and looked directly at her. "Miss Ellison," he said, almost calmly now, "what exactly do you want from this court?" Naomi took a breath. "I want my cousin's citation dismissed, and I want the court to acknowledge that enforcement patterns in this county deserve closer scrutiny." She didn't yell. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The judge looked at the papers in front of him, then at the courtroom, and finally back to her. And then he did something no one expected. He asked, "Can I see your notes?" Naomi blinked. "Excuse me?" "Your notes," he repeated. "You've clearly put time into this. I'd like to look through them." The request wasn't normal. Judges didn't usually ask that. Naomi stepped forward and handed them over. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the bench, but she didn't stumble. The judge flipped through the pages, slowly. Handwritten, color-coded, organized like a junior associate on a fast track at a downtown Atlanta firm. "This is impressive," he said after a long silence. The courtroom stayed quiet. "But you understand that argument isn't always enough in court," he added. "Sometimes, no matter how right you are, the structure doesn't budge." Naomi didn't look away. "Then maybe the structure needs pressure." The judge raised an eyebrow, but before he could respond, someone in the gallery stood up. The woman who stood up in the back row was maybe in her 60s, silver hair pulled back tight, black blouse buttoned all the way to the neck. She had the look of someone who didn't say much unless it mattered. "Your Honor?" she called out, voice steady but low. Judge Talcott turned slowly. "Ma'am, you'll need to sit down. This isn't open for public comment." But the woman didn't flinch. "My name is Judith Minter. I'm a retired attorney, 41 years in civil litigation, and I'd like to say, for the record, that this young lady just gave one of the most well-structured arguments I've seen in a courtroom, including federal ones." Gasps weren't allowed, but there it was again, the audible intake of breath from half the gallery. Judge Talcott stiffened but didn't respond. He just looked at Naomi. Something unreadable flickered in his face. Frustration? Maybe. Or something else entirely. He called another recess. Naomi stepped outside fast. Her chest was tight, and this time her hands were trembling just a little. Not from fear, just from everything. The room, the pressure, the sudden silence that had followed that woman's words. Deshawn trailed her out and sat beside her again. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled and uncurled on her lap. "Why'd she say that?" Naomi finally asked, almost to herself. "Why would someone like her stand up for me?" Deshawn shrugged. "'Cause she saw what everyone else just saw." Naomi let her shoulders drop slightly. Her whole body had been tense for over an hour, and she hadn't even realized it. The courtroom doors swung open again, and to Naomi's surprise, Judith Minter came out and walked toward her. "Miss Ellison," she said gently, as she sat beside her on the bench. "Do you know what kind of courage it takes to stand where you just stood, especially without the credentials? That's not something you can fake. That's born." Naomi opened her mouth, but Judith held up a hand. "I'm not trying to flatter you," she said. "I'm telling you the truth, and if you ever decide to pursue law seriously, I mean professionally, you look me up. I know people who'd be lucky to mentor someone like you." Naomi blinked, not even sure what to say. All she could manage was, "Thank you." Judith smiled, then stood again. "Finish strong. Don't let him twist you up. He's smarter than he acts, but he'll respect you if you stay sharp." With that, the woman disappeared down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the tile. Deshawn turned to Naomi, a mix of awe and disbelief in his expression. "Yo, who are you right now?" She gave a small, almost tired laugh. "I'm just me." But something in her posture had changed. The nerves were still there, but they weren't in control anymore. Not completely. The bailiff stepped through the door. "They're ready." Naomi stood, straightened her shirt, and picked up her folder again. This time, as she walked back into the courtroom, no one whispered. No one smirked. And Judge Talcott didn't lean back in his chair like she was wasting his time. He leaned forward. Naomi returned to the table, laid out her closing statement, and waited for permission. The judge gave her a small nod. Go ahead. She took one more breath, just to steady herself. Then she began. But what she was about to say would leave the entire courtroom speechless. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. My cousin is a teenager. He made a small mistake. But if the law isn't applied fairly to everyone, young, old, black, white, officer, civilian, then it stops being law. It becomes suggestion. Or worse, punishment for some and warning for others. No one shifted in their seats now. Every pair of eyes in that room was fixed on her. Even the clerk, who'd kept her fingers poised over the keyboard, was frozen mid-air. She continued, "We've all heard that justice is blind, but it shouldn't be deaf. It shouldn't ignore patterns, or silence people who speak up about them." Naomi walked slowly to the evidence table, pulled up the citation, and held it out. This citation isn't just about a stop sign. It's about the choice to enforce, or not enforce, the law based on who's in the driver's seat. Her voice was steady, almost calm, but her words hit hard. She turned to the judge. "You asked earlier what I wanted from this court. I told you I wanted the citation dismissed. And I still do. But more than that, I want acknowledgement that fairness shouldn't be earned by a performance or a pedigree. It should be assumed, by default, for everyone." Judge Talcott looked down, tapping the citation folder again with the corner of his pen. He didn't speak. Not yet. "I may not have a degree," Naomi said, "but I've learned something studying courtrooms and opinions and law books for the last 2 years. I've learned that when justice works, it doesn't feel like power. It feels like clarity, like knowing you were heard." Her voice cracked just slightly at that last word. Not enough to break her rhythm, but enough to remind everyone in the room that she was still a teenager, still human, still someone who shouldn't have had to prepare for this. She closed her folder and stepped back. Silence. A full 10 seconds passed before Judge Talcott finally exhaled. He adjusted his glasses, looked around the courtroom, then turned his eyes back to Naomi. "I've been doing this a long time," he said. "Long enough to know when someone walks into this courtroom with something rehearsed, and when they walk in with something real." He paused. "You, Miss Ellison, you came in with something real." Another pause. "I'm dismissing the citation. Not because of who your cousin is, but because of how you presented this case. And because the evidence you provided raised questions this court can't ignore." Whispers broke out across the gallery. Surprised, soft, respectful. But he wasn't finished. Judge Talcott leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "And if I'm being honest, I laughed at you earlier. That was wrong. You didn't just prepare. You educated this courtroom, including me. You held your ground in a place that's never been designed for someone like you to speak with authority. And I suspect this won't be the last time you do." He tapped the gavel once. Not sharply, just to close it. "Court is adjourned." Naomi didn't move at first. Deshawn looked at her like she was someone new, or maybe like he was finally seeing the version of her that had always been there. The people in the gallery didn't rush out. A few approached her quietly. The clerk even nodded once, murmuring, "Nice work, kid." Naomi held her folder close to her chest again. But now it didn't look like a shield. It looked like a credential. As she and Deshawn walked out into the sun, he nudged her. "You're going to be on somebody's billboard one day," she laughed. "Not unless they catch me on a good hair day." He smiled wide. "Nah, I mean it. You changed something in there." Naomi looked ahead at the street, eyes squinting against the light. "I hope so." But what came next would prove that this moment was only the beginning. A week later, Naomi was back in her bedroom, surrounded by stacks of notebooks, loose pens, and her old school laptop covered in faded stickers. Her victory at the courthouse had made local news. Nothing big, just a few blurbs in the Nashville Herald and a Facebook post from someone who'd been in the gallery. But the phone call that changed everything didn't come from a reporter. It came from the office of attorney Roland Brewster, based out of Macon. She almost didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar, and her mom had told her never to pick up calls she didn't recognize. But something told her to press accept. "Is this Naomi Ellison?" the voice on the line asked. "Yes. This is Angela from the office of Roland Brewster. He'd like to speak with you if you have a moment." Naomi sat up straighter on the bed. Sure?" There was a click. Then a man's voice came on. Warm, but direct. "Naomi, my name is Roland. I've been practicing law in Georgia for 27 years. A colleague of mine, Judith Minter, sent me a copy of your court presentation. Said I'd be a fool not to reach out." Naomi didn't say anything at first. Not because she was nervous, because she wasn't sure it was real. "I want to offer you something," he continued. "It's not a job. Yet, but it's a mentorship, one that could turn into something down the road. We've got a summer program for young minds, people who think differently. I want you in it." She finally found her voice. "But I'm not in college. I haven't even graduated high school." He chuckled. "Doesn't matter. We're not looking for degrees. We're looking for minds that can shake up rooms." Naomi stared at her notes, the same ones she'd used in court, now scattered across her desk like forgotten trophies. "I'm interested," she said. "Good," Brewster replied. "Send me a copy of that argument. I want to read it myself. Then we'll talk again." After the call, Naomi sat there for a long time, not moving, not smiling, just absorbing. Something had shifted. The courtroom had ended, but her path, that strange, self-built road she'd paved alone with library books and YouTube lectures, was no longer invisible. Her mum peeked into the room. "You hungry?" she asked. Naomi nodded, starving. As they sat across from each other at the tiny kitchen table, her mum asked, "You think you really want to do this? Law? For real?" Naomi chewed her sandwich slowly, then said, "Yeah, I think I already am." Her mum gave her a look, one of those long, searching glances only mothers have, and then nodded once. "Then you better keep showing them who you are." That night, Naomi stayed up reading again, not out of pressure, but purpose. Case law felt less like homework now, and more like a language she was finally fluent in. The next morning she got another call, this time from a high school student 2 towns over. "Hey," the girl said. "I saw what you did. My brother's got a similar case. I don't know where to start. Can I ask you something?" And just like that, Naomi became something else. Not just a smart kid, not just a cousin defending family. She became an example, a reminder that brilliance doesn't wait for permission, and justice doesn't require a title, only truth, clarity, and the guts to speak up. She didn't need a law degree to change a courtroom. She just needed a chance. And when she got it, she made sure no one ever looked at her the same way again. Your voice doesn't need a podium. It just needs to be heard. If Naomi's story moved you, make sure to subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded. It's not about where you start, but how hard you're willing to show up.